Staff, please take the roll.
Ms. Ortega, representing the Director of Finance. Here. Ms. Dillon.
Here.
Ms. Hendricks.
Here.
Mr. Unterman. Oh, step away. Sorry.
He's here.
That's okay. Chairperson Keeley, you have a quorum.
Thank you very much. Before we begin the committee work, I'd like to formally welcome Controller Ms. Betty Yee to CalSTRS. We're very honored to have you with us. We look forward to your contribution to our work. On behalf of California's educators, it's great to have you with us. Thank you. So first item on the agenda is the approval of the committee agenda and work plan. I'd entertain a motion to approve, please.
So moved.
Second.
It's moved by Dana and seconded by Irena. All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Opposed? Thank you. Item number 2 is the approval of the minutes of the November 5th, 2014 Compensation Committee meeting, open session. Entertain a motion to approve, please.
So moved.
Moved by Dana, seconded by Irena. All those in favor? Aye.
Aye.
Opposed? Item 3, which is an information request. We have staff here as well as two of our two consulting firms with us that have worked on the policy revisions. Reminder to the committee that this is an information item. So this is a great opportunity as we go through this item with staff and our consultants. If there are suggestions, recommendations, or amendments, this is the time to provide those. Because it is related to compensation, sometimes we look at an information item and we move to adopt and take action. At times we do that. I'm going to recommend we don't do that in the event that something arises after the committee meets today and we want to make a suggestion. We'll bring it back for adoption in June. So with that, I'll turn it over to Cassandra. Cassandra.
Thank you, Chair Healy, and good afternoon, members of the board. This item brings to the committee a number of proposed changes to the board's compensation policy manual, section 700. The proposed changes were generated by a number of recommendations from the consultants that you just mentioned. It initiated with our board governance consultant, Amy McDuffie from Aon Hewitt. And then we had investment consultants, Makita and Pension Consulting Alliance also opine on their respective areas of responsibility. We've also asked Global Governance Advisors, who is the board's compensation consultant, to opine in the various areas. But I'm going to go through the changes distinctly so that we can address them individually and have the consultants that are responsible for those areas opine on those that we walk through as we go through them. The changes focus on 4 distinct areas. One is the separation of the compensation policy from the administrative procedures. 2 is the performance benchmarks and the qualitative weighting allocations. The 3rd is the incentive criteria for the performance weightings of our CEO. And the 4th is procedural and technical housekeeping changes. And starting with the separation from policy and procedures, if you recall, in November of 2014, the board governance consultant, Amy McDuffie, who's here with us in front of you, of Aon Hewitt, recommended that the board look at the content of their compensation policy and separate material that was more procedural and technical in nature from the actual framework of the policy. A draft revision of that policy, of that streamlined version, was presented to the board governance committee at that time. And the committee had decided that they wanted to refer it back to the compensation committee for evaluation and review. And the committee directed staff to work with Amy McDuffie in drafting a streamlined policy and separate into a separate document administrative procedures. And so we have those draft documents included in the material. We have the streamlined policy and the administrative procedures that contain a number of other recommendations that we'll walk through. But I wanted to give Amy McDuffie an opportunity to discuss the content of the slimmed down version of the policy and from her perspective.
Thank you, Cassandra. Mr. Chair, members of the committee, good afternoon. I'm Amy McDuffie with Aon Hewitt. It's a pleasure to be here today. And as Cassandra mentioned, I met with the governance committee in November, and we talked at that time about bifurcating the board level governance matters from the administrative procedures. And that was a recommendation that resulted from a broader review of the board's governance manual. And really the desired outcome from this activity was to increase the readability of the policy itself, and then also just make it more consistent with the rest of the policies that appear in the board's policy manuals. So given the draft compensation policy that we previewed, if you will, to the Governance Committee in November, the conceptual comments around that, I believe, if I remember correctly, were that we wanted to make sure that the details, the administrative details, could still be viewed by the board. That was an important aspect as we move forward in this. And the committee itself approved the concept, and that's why we're here today. Attachment 1, in essence, provides the policy, the new draft policy for your review. I've reviewed it, and I believe that it aligns with the intent that the committee, the governance committee, had in mind, which was, again, to just capture the board-level responsibilities. Attachment 2 reflects the administrative mechanics that were placed in the policy to begin with. And from my perspective and working with staff and hearing about the process that was taken to separate, there was a very thorough, comprehensive look at this to ensure that there were no contradictory provisions that resulted in the new policy, and that you received a red line version so you can very clearly see what was removed and transferred. Nothing was deleted at this time, or if it was, there was a comment in the administrative procedures document, which is attachment 2, that provided the detail. So from that, again, I do believe it aligns with the intent that the governance committee had in mind, and I'd be certainly happy to take any questions that the committee has about the changes that were made in this particular draft.
We have questions for Ms. McDuffie on the work on creating this more streamlined document. Amy, from your perspective, is there any substantive change in these two documents between the first document and the second document?
No, Mr. Chair, not from my perspective. Again, we're just trying to reinforce that the policy, the general compensation philosophy of the board and the objectives of the program were laid out in the policy, and that indeed has occurred.
Cassandra?
When we were working on bifurcating the policy from the procedures, what we recognized that we thought would be important for the board was to have visibility in the streamlined version of the things that you have governance over. Now, the details on how you apply that governance would be in the separate document. So I think that that's how we structured and approached the streamlined version, not the details of what you do with the governance responsibility.
I do want to add, in terms of substance, and Cassandra and her team made a note of this in your administrative procedures, but for example, the temporary DCIO assignment, that section in itself was removed because it's no longer applicable in the environment. So from that perspective, that is a substantive change, but it's just no longer relevant.
Mr. Unterman?
Tracking the changes as I do. The question I've got is, what would this mean in terms of what would we do differently once this is done? What difference does this make in how we act?
Well, in terms of the structure, the concept of restructuring, there really won't be a lot of difference. I think there is still a discussion that the committee may want to have around where the administrative procedures document itself is placed so that you can access it in your decision making. But other than that, I can't really think of.
That's what I thought. But
Yeah, in terms of the structure. Now, there are some other changes that you'll be discussing today that are suggestions for your consideration, but in terms of just the structure itself, not much.
Okay.
Any other questions for Ms. McDuffie? Okay. Thank you. There's the second step in this process. Is this also with you, Amy, or is this going?
I'll go ahead and take it.
Okay, thank you, Cassandra.
The second piece that I mentioned was addressing the performance benchmarks and qualitative weighting allocations of the asset classes. And historically, just from background information, the last review, the comprehensive review that the board has undertaken or the committee has undertaken, was 2009. And since that time, we have done incremental evaluations as asset classes are developed or things have changed incrementally throughout the years. The most recent changes that we undertook were the changes to the private equity benchmark in 2013-14 and the changes in the weightings for the asset classes of innovation and infrastructure. When we were undertaking that engagement with our investment consultant, Pension Consulting Alliance, they had recommended that we do a thorough review, an in-depth review of all of the asset classes within the portfolio, including the total fund relative to the benchmarks, the maximum performance matrix, and the weighting allocations within those. So from that, the committee directed staff to work with PCA and Makita, the two investment consultants, to conduct an in-depth review, which we have been working through since November. From that, both consulting firms have provided recommendations, and I'm going to go through those. And PCA, I think Neil Rue is here to answer questions, and then we have somebody on the line from Makita. Also, from their recommendations, we asked our compensation consultant to evaluate the changes from a compensation perspective, and they have conducted stress testing on what would be the outcome of the how would it have impacted the incentive if we had changed benchmarks based on, or weighting allocations based on the recommendations from the investment consultants. And they're going to go over that their perspective in a presentation in just a little bit. But from the recommendations from the investment consultants, and these are substantive changes, which is separate from the bifurcation of the policy and the procedure. So these other things that we're going to be talking about are substantive. One is, the first is to reduce the maximum performance scale of the total fund from 60 basis points to 40 basis points. And then two, change the allocation of global equity from a 67 active, 33 passive to a floating calculation of actual weightings, and reduce the maximum performance scale currently at 90 basis points. Now, PCA and Makita differed in their opinion on what that maximum performance scale should be. PCA recommended 60 basis points, and Makita recommended 50 basis points. For the purpose of stress testing, when we provided the information to Global Governance, they measured it on an assumption that it would be 60 basis points. So they will speak to how it may differ if you lowered that benchmark even further. The third is to reduce the maximum performance scale for corporate governance, currently at 90 basis points, with the same differing maximum performance scale of 60 recommended by PCA and 50 recommended by Makita. And then for the weightings within two of the asset classes, there was a recommendation that we change the qualitative component of corporate governance from 20% to 30%, and the quantitative asset portfolio component from 50 to 40. So it's taking quantitative weightings and putting it into the qualitative weighting. And then changing also the qualitative component of innovation and risk from 20 to 40, and reducing the quantitative asset portfolio component from 50 to 30. So it's taking the 20 quantitatively and putting it towards the qualitative component. So with that, Chris is here also to answer any questions. He is very familiar with the recommendations, and we have the investment consultants. And again, Global Governance Advisors is here for questions if you want to pose any at this time.
Sandra. Mr. Aylman, would you like to add anything from your perspective relative to the process and what brings us here to this point?
Just that for some of the committee that are new, a lot of these have not been revised for over a decade. They were designed in about 2003. We've made subtle changes to some of the other asset classes, but not the total plan, and then particularly these asset classes. So as you can see, you were consulted up. You've got GGA, you've got Makita and PCA that all chimed in. We just sat back and commented at the staff perspective, so I think I'm here to answer any questions about it, and they've obviously scrubbed all the numbers.
Ms. Ortega?
I have a question, I think, for Chris, and I may be thinking about this wrong, so help me a little bit. But one of the the comments in the report is that the benchmarks are unrealistic and inconsistent with risk management approaches. So that presents the existing benchmarks as an issue of risk, that we would be pushing staff to be outside of our risk approaches in order to meet these targets. And so I wondered, given that we've existed with these targets for this period of time, does that mean behavior will change now as a result of the new targets? What would we expect to change as a result of this policy?
I would say from the staff perspective, I wouldn't expect anything to change with these. Part of it has to do, and I don't think our risk has changed dramatically from 2003 to now. We dialed down the risk in the real estate portfolio, and we changed that benchmark. But from that time period forward, the complexity of the portfolio, and then I would say, I don't remember if it was PCA or actually Makita that made that comment. Makita's looking at this for the first time, so you're just getting a different perspective and a different opinion. We play things pretty close to the vest. We don't try to add or time the market. I think we thought originally coming out of the 1990s that 90 or 60 basis points was a good number for the total plan. At times we have been able to produce that, but as we've seen in the last decade, it's tougher and tougher in these markets. And as you've seen in our asset allocation, we're probably playing it closer to home because of all the global risks. So I think it's the recognition that it's harder to add that kind of extra value.
So then my follow-up question, and I think it goes to the harder to add the value, is if we're not changing behavior, then the effect of this policy change is really changing the incentive awards. That's the...
You're lowering, right, you're lowering the reach of how far you have to go. Part of that has to do with our active managers. I think if you had asked us in the late 90s or early 2000s, we would have said we think our active managers can beat their benchmark by 100 basis points for a myriad of reasons, but just the speed of information now, even more than then, we're finding that active managers just can't add that much value. So they're going to still have their same risk budget. They'll still reach where they were. I think we've just recognized that those goals were just too far away. And that, as we've said, extra return is harder and harder to achieve now than it was a decade ago.
So then I just want to understand as the conclusion that we are, with the current framework, we were not appropriately compensating those folks, because then that's what it seems like it's about, rather than about risk and changing our approach.
That's the broader issue that they bring up of total compensation. It is known in the industry that our benchmarks are harder to beat than somebody across the river. So from a total comp perspective, we're trying to bring ourselves in line so that somebody, when they look at two jobs, can go, okay. And I would tell you openly, I had a UC regent say to me, oh, our benchmarks are realistic. And I think he just said that assuming his knowledge was that ours were not, are too hard of a reach.
Cassandra? Thank you.
I think that we don't want to set targets or benchmarks that are unachievable, because that does drive or poses the concern of is staff going to take additional risk to try to reach those benchmarks. But we also don't want to set benchmarks that are too low that just builds it right into their assumed compensation rate. One of the things that you might want to look at in evaluating whether or not we go with making a change at all or going to 60 basis points or 50 basis points is on a 10-year look back. If and I was discussing this with global governance advisors, would they have hit their benchmark every single year? And if they would, based on these new benchmarks, then that might not be the appropriate level to set it at. But you can kind of look at how that would have played out historically. So.
Mr. Enterman?
Hi. Yes, I was just going to comment on Arena's questions. I mean, there's sort of two sides to a coin. Are you increasing pay, or are you disincenting people to take excess risk? I tend to see it as disincenting the taking of excess risk and putting us at more risk as we go.
Ms. Dillon?
So I have a couple more general questions before we get into the actual wording of the policy. So Cassandra, when, where PCA, wanted to reduce the maximum from 90 to 60 and Makita wanted to drop it to 50. I'm assuming from just the difference there that Makita and PCA agreed on all other aspects that they were talking about, correct? And none of our employees that are under the comp policy are eligible for automatic or annual salary adjustments, so that means that they aren't part of the whatever negotiations happen within the state, like step and column. For us, it's step and column. I don't know what it is for state employees, so they're not eligible for salary increases that are provided through bargaining with the state, correct?
No, the governance of their salary ranges are set by the board, and then any step increases or adjustments within that salary range, other than Chris and Jack, are delegated to Jack and Chris.
So they're most definitely eligible for raises, but it's a flexible amount of money based on an annual decision that Chris makes as a recommendation to me.
Right, it's
Unless they are,
whatever from the bargaining unit that gets
Right, well, these
whatever through negotiations with the state.
Yeah,
yeah,
they're
these employees aren't in the bargaining unit that we're referencing here, are they? Any of them?
not in a bargain, they're not in a, well, IO3s
Yeah.
are, but they're,
Yeah.
yes, the IO3s are, yes.
So there's a portion of them that are still eligible for whatever increase or bargained by their collective bargaining agreements then.
The IO3s that are in bargaining unit 1 are eligible for step increases, and their salaries are not governed by the board. Their salaries are governed by CalHR. And their bonus is collectively bargained. So they have a 15% bonus. What is tied to this policy relative to the IO3s is weightings that we change within the construct of the policy, because IO3s that are assigned to corporate governance are going to follow the corporate governance parameters. Those that are prescribed or assigned to private equity are going to follow the private equity weightings within that asset class. It's just based on their 15% agreed upon bonus structure right now.
Any other questions on this aspect of the presentation? Chris, can you give an example of when the fund or asset class has performed well, but because the hurdle rate or the benchmark, what we're trying to reach, the 60 basis points, that reach was so great that even though our comparison to other large institutional investors was good, we compared maybe favorably, but we did not receive, employees were negatively affected as a result?
Well, and the best example would be the last 2 years. We've had double-digit returns. You've seen kind of our peer group analysis, which is that we're in the top quartile, even the top decile. And in many cases, 3 of the 5 asset classes, even 4 of the 5 asset classes might beat their benchmark. But because of that one issue with the private equity benchmark was such a mismatch, it wiped out the alpha, the outperformance of the other 4 to the extent that the total fund can't beat its benchmark. So the Audit and Risk Committee talked about it. Benchmarks and how you measure things is really important, and the benchmark you pick and the spread you look for affects how you judge yourselves, how we judge ourselves, but then also how we incentivize and motivate people.
All right, so a third aspect of this item, there are 4 parts to this. This is
Right.
the third one.
Right. So
Okay.
the third part is the incentive criteria and performance weightings of the CEO. And this was being reviewed at the request of the committee who directed staff to work with global governance advisors to evaluate that incentive criteria. And the committee asked specifically that the weighting allocations of the total fund within the CEO's performance criteria be reassessed in consideration of the nominal influence his role has on fund performance. Currently, the weighting is set at 30%. So global governance, in their evaluation and review, also provided an opinion on the CEA's performance weightings. And they provided the opinion, and then you could, go over your presentation. They had provided an opinion that his incentive should in part be tied to the total fund performance, and he is the CEO of the entire organization and has responsibility of a number of the administrative areas of all of the parts of the organization. But at a slightly lower level would also be appropriate. And in their recommendation, Global Governance noted that the board may want to consider a sustainability component within the CEO's performance matrix, given the board's long-term strategic focus in this area. So the criteria that's included in, or the weighting breakup in the presentation material that you have would be that the recommendation is reducing the total fund weighting currently at 30% to 25%, and reducing the personal performance from 30% to 25%, and then creating a performance measure around sustainability at 10%, and then retaining the 40% currently assigned to measure performance against the strategic plan. And when I've discussed this with a number of different individuals, the sustainability component a lot of times is assumed to be associated specifically to investments, and it's not related to the investment sustainability responsibilities. It's really the enterprise sustainability for the organization. It's the activity surrounding what we're going to be measuring in the organization. It's building and retaining LEED buildings. It's measuring and reporting our greenhouse gases, and it's all of our reduction targets that we track relative to diverting waste and electric and natural gas usage and water usage. So there's a number of things that I think that we already are tracking and that we are striving towards, that we can set some performance targets surrounding a sustainability performance. Now, if this is something that the committee decides they want to move forward with, then what I would suggest or ask the committee to consider would be to set those performance criteria when we are setting the performance at the beginning, just before the beginning of the plan year. So in June, we could, come together and decide what are we going to be, what do we want the CEO to be looking at, working on, and how do we measure success relative to this new weighting.
Mr. Stanway and Mr. Landers, welcome. It's nice to see you. Since you opined on this and you have some recommendations before us, would you speak a little bit about the process and your thoughts on this issue?
I would. I think Cassandra has pretty well outlined what we did for your committee, and we did actually think about whether there would be two separate reports, because I think there are separate issues in front of you. One is about the alignment of the CEO's objectives and the buckets, if you like, which I think is one puzzle. In the same document, we're also talking about the stress testing, which builds on the last presentation, is to end Ms. Ortega's comment about are we paying more for the same performance, and what does that look like? And so there's two aspects to it. We looked at the incentive measures and weightings of the CEO pay for performance monitoring, and that's the first piece that you'll see in some charts. And then we did what we call backward and forward-looking analysis. So the backward analysis is, if you had in place the new proposals that are in front of you, how much would you have paid your executives? So it's sort of fictional, but it gives you an indication of how the new scheme might work in the future, but nobody's a good forecaster of the future, so it's a good indication. You don't know what the marketplace is going to do in the future. And then we did another piece, which is forward-looking, where we took some scenarios of really good performance in the future, not so good performance in the future, and how might that pay out. So I've worked with many boards. There's some analysis that helps, but there's also some judgment. Are you prepared to, for all the good reasons that were just indicated, perhaps you had people doing very well and they weren't getting any incentive pay for it. Maybe there's a system where you were asking for too much risk. And so those are the tough questions that you wrestle with as a board. So I'm going to sort of give you the introductory pages, and Peter Landers, a partner with our firm who did much of the math, will take you through some of the few pages in the long report, and we're prepared to answer any question that comes out as a result of that.
Before you get to your slides. Let me check to see if, Ms. Yee, did you want to question now, or do you want them to finish it? Thank you.
Okay. So if you go to the next slide, Peter, which I guess I get to do. Okay. So I think I've probably covered this first piece with words, and we don't need to look at another screen of words. I told you there were a couple of buckets work. I think the last point, we can confirm that the changes to the CEO incentive criteria can be justified. We also encourage the committee to review the stress test information so that you're comfortable with the potential incentive payout levels under different scenarios. So you want to make sure that you're providing the right incentives for your executives. You also have a very complex public role of balancing that against many stakeholders. So I'll just fill in this slide that when we look at the CEO incentive criteria, what we said was we understood that you as a board and as an organization felt that sustainability was one of those pillars of your strategic plan, and that your CEO has a role in that, and we've introduced that as a measure going forward. The total fund weighting, we've suggested that could perhaps go down. The strategic planning weighting could stay the same, and the personal assessment weighting could come down a little bit in the chart. So if you look at this chart here, and we'll just put it up quickly, what you currently have is the incentive criteria on the left of your screen, and what the recommendations are for your consideration are the ones with the red circles on it. And you'll see that the total fund portfolio return is a smaller percentage. And our understanding, unlike some of our clients where the CEO has a very big role in investments, you still want that line of sight. We don't think it should disappear, but we think it's reasonable to say that it could be slightly lower, given that you have a chief investment officer, which has the absolute primary responsibility for the fund. So we took some of the points away from that. We felt that the qualitative or personal objectives could still have a significant weight, but that you could create a new category if you felt that was important with respect to sustainability, and give that category 10 points. So that's all we're suggesting that's before you with that aspect of it. So, Mr. Chairman, I don't know whether you want to talk about that aspect as a board, or you want me to go on to the next bucket, but I think they're sort of separate in some ways.
Breaking point for us to get some questions on that specific issue that you've clearly outlined for us in terms of the choice that we have to make, not today, but upon adoption. So why don't we keep it simple, and for some reason, Ms. Yee, you got bumped to go after Mr. Unterman. And in the nature of collegiality, we're going to go with Mr. Unterman first. Mr. Unterman, please don't bump Ms. Yee out of the queue anymore. Go ahead, Tom.
I'll gladly defer.
Your mic screen.
We could spend
Very
5 minutes
good.
deferring to each other. But, so the 10% slug that you've picked out for sustainability, can you talk a little bit about where that comes from, or what your thinking is, or how that's derived? It frankly strikes me as high, but.
That's what?
High.
Well, I think that our experience is that less than 10% is sort of hard in anybody's criteria. If I think of my work week as 50 hours and maybe measure it in time, so that's why I think we probably say a bucket of 10 makes sense. But what may be the question for you as a board, in the scheme of what you're expecting your CEO to do, how high a piece of significance is it? So maybe it would be 5. I think that the danger is we don't want too many categories, and you don't want them too small. I think the other thing you might want to think about as a board is it signal management? Is that a signal you want to send to your CEO and say, you know, we'd like you to spend some energy and effort on that. We think that's important. And if it gets much smaller, then maybe that's not what you want to do.
So how is that different than saying, within the qualitative factors that we apply, one of the very important ones to us is the efforts on sustainability?
So I'll just step in quickly. I think to your point, it is to a certain extent that, because it will be a qualitative assessment. As Cassandra outlined, there are some areas where you may be able to set, specific targets, whether it's on reductions in greenhouse gas emissions or reductions in waste, that type of thing. But I think to a certain extent, that's why we felt, why we said to take 5% out of that qualitative personal assessment, because a lot of that, those sustainability criteria can be thought of as, part of currently your annual personal qualitative assessment. But giving it a specific bucket, I think, again, reinforces that is a long-term strategic priority of the organization, and it really gets the CEO to focus on that specific area that you want him to be focusing on. So that's, I think, the discussion for the board to have is this a more meaningful piece of the long-term strategic objectives of the organization that we want to include it as incentive criteria, or are you comfortable with it the way it currently is being a portion of it in the qualitative assessment already? So
my question would be, would this other then ripple through the organization as part of everybody's incentive compensation?
So, I mean, the key reason why we would put it at 10% for the CEO is, again, recognizing line of sight issues. So he has the ability, the most ability to control the direction of where you go on the sustainability front. Like Mr. Stanway pointed out earlier, below 10%, there becomes a bit of we like to look at it as a meaningful amount that people will actually focus their attentions on. So what we found in our consulting experience is if you put it, say, below 10%, so if it became 5% of someone's criteria, it won't necessarily impact the way that they do their jobs because they feel it's not a meaningful amount. So to a certain extent, it will be in the strategic plan, but we don't see it as necessarily something that would have to be rippled down throughout the organization.
And this is my last question on it, but relative to what we do, would then, if we were electrical generating utility, would you say 25% for sustainability to really get the CEO's attention? Or
I think
the question is one I have is one of proportionality to our mission and the range of work being done. And I just was trying to get a sense of what thinking you did other than, gee, we want it to be a number that means something.
So, Mr. Chairman, I think that there's another aspect which would be the measures that go with these. So I think the discussion that we've had with some of your staff is we're talking about enterprise sustainability, not necessarily entirely environmental sustainability. So some of the things that your CEO has done for you in the past about what I would call creating the authorizing environment with the state and keeping the context within which your organization thrives, that might be the definition that goes with sustainability, not just the environment piece. And we have not done that yet. We've led with what seems to be a lot of discussion about the environment, but it might be the sustainability of you as an organization, and it may not be the investment piece or the environmental piece. To your other question, Mr. Underman, you said, yes, if you were an environmental company, and I'm working for an electric utility and a gas utility right now, it's a really big part of the CEO stuff because they don't want things to blow up. So that's the short answer to your question.
Okay, Ms. Yee.
Oh, I think you just
I'm
buzzed
sorry.
me in. And I should be in the queue, but if Ms. Yee's
Oh.
ahead of me, go ahead.
You know what?
You know what?
You're coming up as John.
Oh,
We're figuring.
okay.
We're going to go to
Need to
Ms. Yee,
update
then
the
we're going to go
technology.
to you, Mr. Boykin.
Buzz out.
Yes, please. Thanks.
Transitioning.
Oh, wow, we're really getting,
No,
going awry over
You will
here.
be.
I bet he's signing in.
Ms. Yee, would you push your button to plug in, please?
And then click her name. And then click up there.
Maybe on the
Very good.
Okay.
Thank you.
All right. Good. Thank you. This was the line of questioning that I had as well, and it really, I guess, revolves around the definition of sustainability. And we just touched upon this in a prior committee meeting, but seems to me, until we define what that means, I'm not so sure that I'm comfortable with, really deciding on a percentage. If it's going to be enterprise-wide, or if we're going to focus on environmental, but And I think it's a new area to where we really have to do a deep dive on what it is that we're, really grasping here.
Thanks. I guess I share some,
Actually,
sorry.
Mr. Rosensteel, and then we're going to get you, Mr. Boykin. I owe you one. I owe you one.
So, how did you decide of all of the strategic priorities of the board that the one that you would identify specifically as opposed to being just part of the qualitative in general, which is carrying out the strategic plan, would be sustainability?
We took the information and lead from your staff who gave us another version with different percentages, and we thought if we were going to add any input, we would change the distribution to give you sustainability. So we understood that it was a given that you as a board thought sustainability was important. It's clear from the dialogue that's not the case. So what we did do is I think we changed the buckets from which you got qualitative, which your staff had suggested to us.
So it started with the staff suggesting.
That's correct.
So you didn't consider, for example, the fact that we're about to consider a contract tomorrow for a $250 million computer system, that maybe that should, if we're going to identify, draw out, focus the CEO on one particular task, that might be more important than sustainability. That wasn't something your decision making was constrained such that wasn't even on the table.
That's correct, and I had the pleasure of listening to some of your audit committee, and it looks like it's an issue for a good number of people on your board. It's a pretty big deal. So that may well be something that you'd want to incorporate in here, land that IT project. That I've had the opportunity in my career to manage multi-$100 million projects in the IT world, and landing them is a pretty big deal. You want to get that right.
So you're also acknowledging that we haven't defined for the purposes of what you're recommending to us what we mean by sustainability, except are you in agreement with Cassandra that it does not include investments?
I'm in agreement with that point, yes.
Okay,
it does not include
that helps. That in my mind, that makes allocating 10% to sustainability less important, because it's a less important piece than of everything that we're doing, because most of what we're doing is investments.
Correct, and so that's why we said let's keep the total fund portfolio significant. I think as I listened to the dialogue, Mr. Chairman, it may well be that it makes sense that there are important initiatives for you as a board that deserve attention and deserve calling out, and maybe you got a bucket that says 10%. If it happens to be landing a $250 million IT project, that sounds like a good one. I think you might have some discussion with one of your board members, Mr. Unterman, who would suggest maybe the bigger buckets work. Our experience,
I would too. I mean, I didn't see any problem with what we were doing. It seems to me that we have a personal bucket, which is the strategic priorities of the organization, which we've defined in our strategic plan.
And they're able to change each year as you see fit.
I think it's important I think it's important, if we're going to do something with sustainability, which I question, that it not be related to investments, because we don't have that as an objective for our chief investment officer. So that would create conflicts between the CEO and the CIO, which does not make any sense. But then if we take investments out of it, I think this board has to question whether 10% of what we think is the most important person in the organization's focus should be on sustainability that does not even encompass sustainable investing. And I've yet to be convinced on that for sure.
Just to add to Mr. Stanway's point, we had, as he had mentioned, talked, with staff, and that had come across. But we have also observed over the past several months, that discussion around sustainability within the organization, and have, listened to the board discuss this issue. So moving forward, it was our understanding that it was a key strategic priority, and that's why it deserved a weighting within the current incentive weighting platform. But if that is something that is, there's still some disagreement on, or you want to clarify more further going forward, then that's something we're also willing to consider. But just wanted to add that point.
Thank you. So Treasurer Chung expressed some of the same concerns that have already been expressed about how to prioritize and how to define sustainability. The question I have is, as I recall, under qualitative, there's about 5 or 6 separate buckets. Does anyone have the list of what those are? Strategic plan, Cassandra?
Yeah, the sustainability is actually in the strategic plan. It's not in the personal leadership component. That includes, and I actually do have it right here. It includes management, communication, policy matters, staff development, and leadership. And then there's different thresholds for achievement within that the board sets every year, targeting before the plan year. So the sustainability focus currently is incorporated within the risk goal of the strategic plan. So what this was doing is pulling it out as a separate focus. If the board has a desire to have a long-term focus in that, then the thought was we would tie some performance targets to that. So.
Each one of those components under the qualitative only gets, I didn't quite do the math there, but 5 or 6%. Right. Is that enough? Do you think any one of those should get more?
Based on our analysis over the last few years, because we I believe helped do that, put that together about 3 years ago, we were comfortable with the weightings that I believe they are 5%, or they were 6% each. We're comfortable at the 5% for each of those sort of small sub contents of the qualitative of where those are at this present time. So yeah, we would be comfortable at 25% that those are the correct weightings.
Some of those I wouldn't say are small, and I think we haven't really had the conversation about how to prioritize them. So I think we'll have to do some more thinking and discussing about how to fit the sustainability piece in.
Okay, yeah, so as they currently are, they have received equal weighting in the past in those 5 criteria, so we would see if that qualitative personal side was brought down by 5%, each one would just go down and they would stay in equal proportion as it's currently located.
5% is not enough to really push behaviors. Thanks.
So I don't see, is that it? I don't see anyone else. Oh, I do. Mr. Unterman.
Yeah, and this is, it may be that we're going to take this up later in the discussion, but I had questions about this matrix as it applied to the deputy CIO and investment directors as well. So if we're going to come to them later, then that's great.
Yeah, can we just hold off on that first?
Sure.
So just, Sharon and Ms. Hendricks, did you want to comment on
I was going to talk about this conversation
that
we've
we just,
been having.
yes,
Yeah.
then we'll put you in the queue right now. Right, Ms. Hendricks?
So I was just going to comment, and I appreciate actually, Ms. Yees, your comments, and I think the question around sustainability that we had, I think, at the offsite, and then there's been conversation about that. I will just sort of as a preview to Friday's investment committee, I know I think we want to have that dialogue on the board. What does sustainability mean? I know for me as a board member, I would love to see us integrate. I don't really like the idea of our CEO being into sustainability, but not the CIO or other stuff. To me, I think, we're an institutional investor that wants to have best practices. And so when I think about it in terms of being a sustainable fund, which means we're a long-term investor that invests in things that help pay teachers' retirement for a long period of time and do that in a fiscally responsible way. So I'm really interested in that conversation. Like, what does sustainability mean? I think as a board, we have to come to some consensus as to when we use that language, what does that imply? And so I guess that's just to say that I think on Friday there's some thoughts about, I think we're having some folks to help us have those conversations as we go on the next few board meetings so that we can have some comfort level and have some probably robust conversations about what we think about sustainable, what sustainability means for CalSTRS. So I look forward to that conversation.
Ms. Dillon.
I'll go ahead and weigh in too. For me, a couple of years ago, the sustainability of the system was our number one priority, and that meant get funding for the system. It really didn't have anything to do with investments. So when I think about sustainability, I think it's a much broad, when we're using it here, it's much broader than what we do just in our investments along sustainability and green and that kind of stuff. I mean, I want to go back to what Cassandra was talking about. We're talking about the efforts that are happening in the building that we are doing on a daily basis here. And Jack being the driver, the CEO being the driver of that, making sure that all those efforts within the building are not only ongoing, but they're also recognized by the staff that actually are implementing that same philosophy. So I too think that we need to take a look at sustainability. I think when we say sustainability, we only think of investments, we're thinking way too narrowly. Now, I for one, am very comfortable with doing sustainability and the qualitative at 10% when we're talking in those terms.
Stanley, you mentioned there are two parts to your presentation, and that was one break-off point. And before we go to the second part of your comments, I want to thank the committee for some great feedback, terrific dialogue, suggestions, ideas. I think what we're trying to do is get compensation right. And we're trying to get a specific aspect of compensation right, that is incentive compensation. And there's a story about how we've gotten to where we are today, and I think that's important for us to have in our framework as we think about where we may want to go into the future relative to incentive compensation for a specific position within the organization. So that whole 30% fact part was something that came out of dialogue through the board and through the committee, where we have an executive in which has been delivering for the system and for our members and our beneficiaries to the high satisfaction of our board for a considerable period of time, where we have felt constrained by that 30% factor. And there's also dynamics within the organization in terms of the reporting organizational chart that we have. So that's part of it as well. So to move away from that sustainability, I think the framework of this conversation is really about, was that 30% aspect of the incentive compensation for the executive position the right number for us? That's kind of where this is all originating from. And there was sentiment amongst the committee that perhaps was not correct, because we felt constrained because that compensation was directly linked to fund performance, and we thought maybe that's too rich of a percentage. So it's kind of how it's coming about. And I think this is such a rich conversation, and it makes me feel good that we're trying to get this better and right. And clearly, we have to define, what do we mean by sustainability? We have to define whether or not we think that 10% should be taken away from the 30% should be peeled back and a new category created. If so, should it be sustainability? If it is sustainability, what do we mean by sustainability? And if we get agreement around that, is it 10%? All of those are the questions that we will work on, and that's why this was an information item and a great discussion. Very rich.
Mr. Chairman, if I might just share with you that the textbooks would suggest one has a strategy and they have some goals, and then they get to compensation. And for many of our clients, that's the way it works. But for a few, and I applaud you as a board, for a few, the discussion itself punctuates the need for clarity that you've outlined. So I applaud you for pausing, and I think you've got the right discussion in front of you, because you'll get that same alignment going forward that you've enjoyed in the past.
We'll go to the second part of your presentation.
Right. The good news for us sitting here is that the next part actually doesn't depend on this part. So I think you can say you've had a good discussion about this. Your chairman's outlined a process that you can go forward with. But without, I can say that the numbers that you'll see going forward don't change terribly by whatever these buckets are that you collect. What they talk more about are the amounts of money that would come out as a result with some different benchmarks and under some different scenarios. And so I think that if we go to the next slide, and I'm just going to press buttons here, and Peter's going to tell you that the first block of information is really up there on the slide, changes approved. You've already approved those, so it would not be, I don't think, a good use of your time to talk about it. It's done. You figured that out. But we thought we'd put that there because they were used in the calculations. So the top part of that page are givens. You've approved them, and they're in place. The next parts are the changes that are proposed. And Peter will describe each of those lines for you, what the changes are. And the reason for this whole work is to say, if we were going to change the benchmarks that you talked about, what would the payout be? And these benchmarks were done on 60 basis points, correct, Peter?
Correct. So, yeah, so for the equity and the corporate governance piece, yes, correct.
And so what you've heard is that there's another consultant recommended it could be 50. So 50 or 60, you'll get to see the indicative information. And if you ask the question later, we'll tell you our best guesses how much difference that would make in payout. But we haven't actually run the numbers. So, Mr. Chairman, if that's all right, I'll ask Mr. Landers to go through the next, I think, only 6 pages, but they're pretty heavy pages, and we're free to ask questions page by page or at the end, whatever you'd like.
Before you do, we have a question from Ms. Yee.
Just a question on the proposed treatment for global equity. I was just curious how that would be applied. Is that once annually, or would it be just a quarterly? I'm just curious.
So that global equity piece, the second line of that second table is referring to only the active investment piece. So there's, in global equities, our understanding is there's 2 portions. There's an active portion and a passive portion. So that treatment is only to the active investments and how those are evaluated. And then if we go to the 4th row, global equity, that's, Cassandra had mentioned that earlier. Currently, you actually measure performance 67% based on the active investment performance and 33% on the passive. Moving forward, the proposed treatment is to go by their actual weightings within your portfolio, which I believe from our analysis was 40% active and 60% passive. So that would be the difference in how those would be evaluated from a performance perspective.
Mr. Chair, I think Mr. Yee's question had to do with, or Ms. Yee's question had to do with the timing. Was it quarterly or not?
I've looked at it more from an annual perspective, and that's the data that we've used to conduct our stress testing. So I would actually ask the investment staff how that exactly is calculated, but we've been provided with annual return figures, and that's what we've used in calculating our results.
Okay, stand here and shout, is that okay? Sure. Performance is measured annually, but we use a 3-year rolling period.
That's correct.
And you get performance information every 6 months, but for these purposes, it's always June 30 over a 3-year period.
And it was on that basis that the calculations are before you.
Thank you.
So we've...
Before you continue, Mr. Oscar. Yep, thanks.
Yeah, I had 2 questions, actually. The one I said I wanted to come back to, which is a grid earlier, and I don't think you get to it in these 6 pages, which is the weighting for the CIO and deputy CIO by asset class as opposed to total fund.
So, yeah,
And since they are doing the total fund, I'm just curious about how you're getting to those numbers. Or what you're thinking about those allocations.
What page are you looking at on the?
Well, I'm back in their original report because
What page on the report, do you know?
it comes up several times, but the first time is on page, it looks like 10 or 11.
Okay.
10 or 11 of their report?
Oh,
Yeah, page 14.
Yeah, several reports.
Yeah, and it's a format that hasn't changed a lot, but it's just, I was curious what you're thinking about that, because,
So, our understanding is, yeah, so the CEO, the CIO and the deputy CIO currently have a large portion put towards a total fund performance, and then there is an allocation towards the, I believe, the average score of asset classes. So for the CIO, it's the five main asset classes. For the deputy CIO, I believe it's the 3 public asset classes. Our stress testing was done under the assumption that that structure would remain. So that's what the stress testing has been done under, is that type of structure.
it isn't something particularly addressed.
Correct. It wasn't asked of us to address that specific information item.
Okay, that's one. And the second, I wondered again whether you gave thought to this at all, that while these are all measures of relative performance, and we have a very clear absolute return objective and requirement, and whether you thought some balancing should be made between relative performance and absolute return performance.
Mr. Chairman, we had the benefit of 2 hours between a previous meeting and this meeting, and that was something Peter and I were talking about when we talked about our various clients in the pension industry. Some people, organizations are in fact moving to a absolute return with the view that they're sustainable, they want to live for a long period of time, and we have one client we were talking about that said they want to get 8% every year. And so we did not in this work look at that question, but it is a question your industry is asking.
But to further on top of that, I would say still the predominant way to measure performance is this relative value-add performance. But as Mr. Stanway said, it is something that we're seeing some of the larger funds, especially in the Canadian marketplace, looking at. Is this something we want to transition to over the next few years, is moving away from that value-add performance, which is looking at, how you've performed relative to just actively investing in an index or passively investing in an index, and more towards, as you're mentioning, we have a stated actuarial threshold. As long as we're meeting that every year or every 3 years on an annual basis, we're comfortable with that. There might be some years where we underperform the market. There might be some where we overperform, but we want to be consistently earning that 9 to 10%. So that is an active discussion going on. But again, a typical market practice is still in that relative value add space.